Imagine that you are a servant and you wipe the queen's bottom with a warm linen cloth, carefully so as not to touch the delicate skin. She sits on a low wooden throne with a round hole in the middle, under which stands a ceramic pot. The smell of warm excrement mixes with the aroma of rose oil, which has been soaked in the cloth beforehand. You do this not because you are forced to, but because it is the highest honor at court. Also, please subscribe to my channel and put a like on this video. Write in the comments your thoughts on this topic. I am very happy to explore the traces of the past together with you. In the Middle Ages, the position of the person who was present when the monarch performed his natural needs was one of the most prestigious. In England, it was called the groom of the stool. In France, the valet de chambre. This person was closer to the king or queen than many ministers and had access to the most personal conversations. At the court of Louis XI, this was not done by servants in the usual sense, but by high-born nobles, sometimes counts, viscounts, and even heirs of noble houses. No one dared to snort or grimace. On the contrary, the position was considered so privileged that there was a real struggle for it among the aristocracy. To be the one holding the royal towel meant not just closeness, but actual access to closed political decisions. It was here, in the silence of the morning ritual, that the monarch could confide what he did not even tell the council of ministers. The ritual was carefully thought out. Thin linen towels were preheated by the fireplace to make them pleasantly warm. Sponges made of seafoam or soft moss were soaked in a decoction of herbs, rosemary, lavender, mint, and sometimes wormwood, to mask the smell. On particularly solemn days, such as before receiving foreign ambassadors, a drop of Damascus rose oil was added to the water, and at that moment, the smell of excrement mixed with the aroma of the royal garden, creating a strange, almost surreal atmosphere. In some courts, it reached the point of absurdity. Chroniclers' records mention that in the particularly caring years of Louis XI, crushed lily petals, the symbol of France, were added to the rubdown to remind the royal person of her divine mission, even in the most intimate moments. In England, under Henry VIII, the groom of the stool was not just a man with a towel. He was a government official who signed the most important documents, managed the royal treasury, and controlled payments to the aristocracy. The monarch trusted him so much that it was on the toilet throne that he discussed with him issues of war, marriage, executions, and amnesties. There is evidence that some decisions about the fate of entire cities were made, while the king, relaxed, leaned back, waiting to be dried. It was part of the strange logic of the Middle Ages. The closer you were to the monarch's body, the greater your political weight. It didn't matter what you held in your hands, a sword, a pen, or a towel. Thus, morning after morning, wiping and carefully examining the contents of the pot became not a humiliation, but a pass into the world of secret negotiations, court intrigues, and dangerous secrets. For us, it seems unimaginable, but for the people of that time, it was as natural a start to the day as a cup of strong morning coffee is for us. Once the morning toilet throne is cleared and the towels are washed, the next ritual begins, bringing the royal person's face into proper shape. To us, this sounds like light makeup, but at the court of the Middle Ages and early modern period, everything turned into near torture. You see a maid take a porcelain bowl containing a thick, grayish-white mass. It is bird droppings, usually pigeon or nightingale, carefully ground into powder, mixed with vinegar or rose water. She carefully applies this sticky, ammonia-scented paste to the queen's cheeks and forehead, like a precious cream. No one winces, because it is obvious to everyone that this is a care that will keep the skin pale, clean, and palatially perfect. Belief in the miraculous properties of droppings dates back to ancient times. The Greeks used pigeon droppings as a bleaching agent, and Roman women valued it for its ability to smooth out the skin. Medieval recipes mention it as a remedy against freckles and female spots, as any pigmented formations were called. Chemically, it does contain ammonia, which corrodes the upper layer of the skin, but also bacteria that cause inflammation. After the first layer of dung was washed away, the stage began that killed slowly and unnoticeably. Lead powder was applied to the skin, thick, cold, giving the face a matte whiteness. In England, it was called Venetian ceruse because it was believed that the best samples were brought from Venice. It included vinegar, which was used to process lead, obtaining lead carbonate, a deadly toxic white powder. Women applied powder not only to their faces, but also to their necks, shoulders, sometimes even their chests, and in extremely rare cases, even to their genitals. If the dress had a deep neckline, paleness was considered a symbol of high origin. A tan was a sign of peasants who worked in the fields, and white skin spoke of life in halls under a canopy, away from the sun. Lead gradually penetrated the body through the skin and mucous membranes, causing chronic poisoning. The victim's hair darkened and fell out, their teeth became loose, and neurological disorders appeared. But this did not stop the fashion. Chroniclers' records contain descriptions of noble ladies who continued to use cerus even when their skin began to fester under a layer of powder, simply because appearing in public naturally was considered a disgrace. There were also special recipes for effect. In some courts, crushed pearls were added to lead powder, not for the benefit, but for the sake of shine, so that the skin shines in the candlelight. In France, fashion went so far as to include finely crushed beetles in the composition. Supposedly, they gave the skin a live blush. To achieve the perfect porcelain face, Venetian courtesans applied a thin layer of egg white under the lead base, which tightened the skin and made it smooth, like a taut drum. When walking, the face barely moved, which made the women appear haughty and royal. Elizabeth I of England, suffering from smallpox scars, covered her face with a thick layer of cerus for years, which eventually led to severe lead poisoning. Contemporaries noted that in old age, she began to wear increasingly massive wigs to hide her thinning hair and blackened forehead. Another interesting fact, in some countries, for example in Spain, bird droppings for cosmetics were collected not just anywhere, but in special palace dovecotes, so that the ingredient was pure from birds that ate grain, not carrion. It was believed that such droppings were more noble and brought royal purity to the skin, but the result was the same: the slow destruction of the body for the sake of external perfection. Every morning began with the queen's face being covered with a mixture of dung, lead, oils, and aromas that were both intoxicating and poisonous. This was the whole point of courtly beauty. It cost health, but gave the illusion of eternal youth and power. Once the queen's face had been covered in dung, lead powders, and the scent of rose attar, the next big thing of the day came: the meal. But unlike today's lunch or dinner, medieval and early modern royal feasts rarely had a clear beginning and end. They were a continuous flow of food and wine that could last for hours or even days. The main purpose of such feasts was not to get full. The feast was a demonstration of the power, wealth, and generosity of the host. And this is what gave birth to one of the strangest and most disgusting court customs: to induce vomiting between courses in order to continue eating. In the rich courts of France, Italy, and England, this process was so common that separate places and servants were set aside for it. Chroniclers describe so-called stomach relief corners, areas behind screens, behind tapestries, or in small rooms adjoining the banquet hall. There were basins, buckets, or simply straw there, where guests went to free themselves and return to the table. This custom was especially popular in France during the time of Charles VI. At feasts attended by several hundred people, people were hired to hold basins and jugs of warm water at the aisles. Guests were offered to rinse their mouths or wipe themselves before returning to the meal. To mask the smell, sprigs of rosemary, lavender, or mint were distributed. In Italy, especially in Venice and Naples, the habit of preparing the stomach for the next course even took the form of a ritual. At particularly lavish celebrations, servants would carry goblets of warm, salted water or weakly diluted wine to guests, which would induce a gag reflex. Some halls were equipped with small vomitoriums, a word that came from ancient Rome, although in ancient times it meant an architectural passage rather than a place for vomiting. In the Middle Ages, the term was already understood literally. The menu of such feasts was astonishing in its scope: whole carcasses of deer and wild boar, peacocks with tails recreated from feathers, swans in gold glaze, dozens of meat and fruit pies, jellied fish dishes, jugs of spiced wine, mead, and strong liqueurs. All this was served continuously, alternating with entertainment, music, dancing, performances of jesters and magicians. But satiety set in quickly, and then the guests went behind the screen. There, behind the tapestry, one could see a noble knight in an expensive doublet leaning over a basin, holding the edge of the table or the shoulder of a servant with his hand. For those around, this was not something shameful. Rather, on the contrary, a demonstration of the ability to participate in feasts to the fullest extent. Chronicles even mention some kind of competitions. At the court of the Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, feasts were held where the winner was the one who could return to the table the most times, each time freeing himself from the previous round of food. Sometimes a gold cup or rare fabric was given as a prize. In England under Henry VIII, male courtiers, especially those who wished to please the king, tried to keep up with the pace of eating and drinking. Henry, himself famous for his love of rich feasts, did not always participate in these wastes, but he knew that it was in the breaks between courses that courtiers exchanged the latest gossip and political intrigue. Even stranger customs were common in some Italian principalities. There, between courses, they could serve the so-called cleansing soup, a light broth with herbs that acted as a laxative or emetic. It was believed that it prepares the body to enjoy the following dishes. Contemporaries also described some very unpleasant scenes. In crowded halls, when there was not enough space behind the screen, guests could simply lean against the wall or into a corner and quickly free themselves, after which they would return to the table, wiping their mouths with a sleeve or a towel. No one even interrupted the conversation. It's all part of a culture where luxury was measured not just by the number of dishes served, but by the ability to physically endure the feast to its end. It seems downright crazy today, but in the Middle Ages, such scenes were as common a part of the feast as music or toasts. Thus, to the clink of cups, the noise of musicians, and the laughter of jesters, the guests returned to the table again and again, as long as their strength and stomachs allowed, and sometimes even longer. After the sumptuous feasts, where vomiting was considered only a break between courses, life at court continued in the same spirit. And if for us today, spitting on the floor in a room full of people is the height of bad manners, then for the monarchs and nobility of the Middle Ages, such a thing was an ordinary, almost routine action. Chronicles of the 15th and 16th centuries have preserved dozens of descriptions that would make a modern person wince. Imagine you are standing in a magnificent hall, the walls of which are covered with expensive tapestries. Carpets woven in Persia are under your feet, and in the center is a king or queen in brocade and velvet. And suddenly, without interrupting the conversation, the monarch turns his head and spits right on the stone floor and then wipes his lips with his sleeve. In France, during the time of Francis the Burns, not only was this not considered shameful, but on the contrary, it demonstrated a certain naturalness and humanity of the sovereign. The king could conduct a diplomatic conversation with the ambassador, listening to a report on the war in Italy, and at the same time, squinting, spit out the remains of food stuck between his teeth. Blowing your nose was done with even less formality. Handkerchiefs in the form we are accustomed to were rare then, and many nobles simply blew their noses into their own sleeves or the edges of their waistcoats. The chronicles of the English court of Henry VII mention that the king, suffering from a chronic runny nose, liked to blow his nose right during meetings and then wiped his hand on a velvet curtain. Servants then cut off and replaced the soiled pieces of fabric. The Spanish Habsburg kings brought this to a kind of etiquette. Philip II, for example, could wipe his nose on his own collar during audiences, and then, without changing his intonation, continue discussing the fate of sea expeditions. His courtiers, imitating the sovereign, blew their noses in the same way, considering it a sign of closeness. There are even wilder accounts. Venetian ambassadors visiting the French court in the 16th century complained in their reports that the floor of the room where they were received was strewn with dried spittle, and that along the walls hung banners with yellow stains from blowing noses. The smell, they said, was such that any honest man would prefer to negotiate in the street. Sometimes spitting became part of a table game. At the court of Henry VIII, there was a habit during hunts or outdoor feasts to compete to see who could spit a wine bone or a fish bone the farthest. This was done right at the table, laughing and encouraging each other. Sometimes they hit the helmets of servants, who were unable to dodge. Northern monarchs, for example, in Denmark and Sweden, had a custom of cleaning their teeth with a dagger or the tip of a knife during feasts and spitting the scraps of food under the table or toward the fireplace. Since the fireplace was usually large, not only the scraps of food flew there, but also copious amounts of spit, which, when they hit the hot coals, gave off a sharp, unpleasant smell. Particularly shocking to foreigners was the custom of blowing one's nose directly onto the floor during religious ceremonies. At the court of the Polish king, Sigismund II Augustus, it was noted that in a crowded chapel during Mass, courtiers did not hesitate to blow their noses into their palms and then simply shake the mucus onto the stone slabs. No one reprimanded them for this. In the cold halls and drafts, everyone had a runny nose. In Italy, Renaissance palaces sometimes had special spittoons, bronze or ceramic vases, where guests could spit during a conversation. But if they were far away, no one considered it shameful to spit directly on the marble floor and then crush the spit with the heel of a boot so as not to slip. All this took place against a backdrop of luxurious fabrics, gilded chairs, exquisite decorations, and it is precisely the contrast between the splendor of the setting and the dirty habits that makes these scenes so vivid. For us, this is a sign of a lack of culture, but for them, it is a natural part of everyday life. Spitting or blowing your nose was not an act of disrespect. It was as ordinary as smoothing your hair or adjusting your cuff. And just as with vomiting, many moments involving spitting and nose blowing became opportunities for courtiers to show their closeness to the monarch. If the king blew his nose into his sleeve, a loyal servant could immediately offer a clean piece of cloth or even remove the soiled item of clothing from the sovereign. This was not only a sign of concern, but also a chance to be close, to hear confidential words, and to receive a small but valuable favor. Grandeur and dirt, that's what went hand in hand in the Middle Ages. And the palace walls remembered everything: gold crowns and dried stains on expensive fabrics. While regular body washing is the norm today, in the Middle Ages, kings and queens could wash less often than the peasants they despised. Bathing, especially in cold stone castles, was considered not only unnecessary, but also harmful. Water was thought to soften the body, open the pores, and allow diseases to penetrate. Even in the 15th and 16th centuries, the nobility had a common attitude: cleanliness is clean clothes, not the body. In Europe, washing with soap was rather exotic. The king could change clothes several times a day, putting on fresh linen shirts, but not touch his skin with water for months. The smell was hidden under layers of perfume, aromatic oils, and lotions. It is known that Queen Isabella of Castile was proud of the fact that she washed herself only twice in her life, at birth and before her wedding. For her contemporaries, this was not a reason for jokes, but a sign of piety and restraint. In France, Henry IV, known as Good King Henry, was considered incredibly attractive to the ladies, but according to the memoirs of his mistress, Gabrielle d'Estrées, he exuded such a persistent smell of sweat and skin soaked in secretions that even the aromas of amber and musk could not mask it. Henry loved hunting and war, but hated bathing, believing that water drained strength. Even more exotic were the ideas about the cleansing power of friction. At the courts of Francis XIII and Henry VIII, washing was replaced by rubbing the skin with dry towels, woolen shawls, or even crushed sand mixed with herbs. This was considered sufficient hygiene. Sometimes the skin was sprinkled with flour or powdered roses to hide the greasy shine and smell. In cold countries like Denmark or Sweden, swimming in winter was considered almost crazy. Monarchs and their entourage relied on perfume and frequent changes of clothing. Interestingly, it was at royal courts that the heaviest and most persistent perfumes appeared, not for pleasure, but to combat stench. At the Spanish court in the 17th century, scented fans were used for this purpose. A lady could hold a conversation, hiding behind a lace fan soaked in jasmine oil so as not to inhale the smells of her neighbors. People went to the bathhouse not for cleanliness, but for ostentatious pleasure. Turkish sultans and Eastern rulers, on the contrary, cultivated washing rituals, but the European nobility viewed this as a dangerous luxury. Public baths operated in Paris, but kings visited them extremely rarely, and only in cases of serious illness or for special ceremonies. There was a popular belief that frequent washing shortened life. Doctors at the court of Louis XVI advised the king not to immerse himself in water more than twice a year. Instead, the skin was wiped with wine vinegar, believing that it killed harmful fumes. Sometimes crushed dried herbs were added to the vinegar to give the body a scent. In England, during the time of Elizabeth I, washing was also not a habit. The Queen herself considered it sufficient to bathe once a month, and then only in good weather. At the same time, she used an entire army of perfumers who rubbed her hands and face with fragrant balms every day so that her skin looked fresh. Elizabeth was famous for her outfits but contemporaries noted that under layers of satin and velvet, her skin was often covered in rashes and dirt. At the Austrian court in the 18th century, despite the emergence of more progressive views, old habits still persisted. Emperor Franz I was convinced that a hot bath could cause a stroke and preferred to wipe the body with a damp cloth, avoiding full immersion in water. The most curious thing is that rare bathing was not considered shameful even when receiving foreign guests. In the 1600s, the Spanish ambassador to London wrote in a report that the air in the halls of the English palace was so thick with odor that it seemed as if it had weight. But at the same time, the ambassador himself, according to Spanish tradition, washed no more than once every few months. Even the royal lovers and mistresses tolerated this routine. Women wore small bags of dried herbs on their chests. Men rubbed their hair with powder to mask the smell of sweat. As a result, the entire atmosphere of the court halls was a mixture of incense, mold, fumes, and unwashed bodies. It sounds wild to us, but for the Middle Ages and the early modern period, it was the norm, part of the idea of health and status. Cleanliness was measured not by the freshness of the skin, but by the richness of the clothes and the density of the perfume. And if today we cannot imagine a king who has not taken a shower, then for their contemporaries, the image of a ruler who has not washed for a year was not at all strange, but rather familiar and even respectable.